Now, the trunk neural crest cells are the ones we're going to spend the most time with because there's a lot of things we know about these as well as influences we understand. The early migratory cells typically migrate ventrolaterally. So what I mean is they migrate downwards towards the belly and somewhat sideways. Okay? The late migratory cells typically migrate dorsolaterally, which means they migrate outward towards the periphery rather than towards the ventral region. So those are the two major pathways that the trunk neural crest cells take. The early migratory cells are what become most of these various fates. Schwann cells that are going to myelinate the axons. This is the ones I'm going to focus on, though, the sensory dorsal root neurons. These are the ones we're going to spend a lot of time on today because it starts forming the peripheral nervous system, essentially the sympathetic, and then we'll talk about the vagal and sacral, which are the parasympathetic. The late migratory cells, these are just melanocytes. Okay? So when they migrate dorsolaterally, they receive their respective signals to differentiate into melanocytes. They're not receiving the same paracrine factors that these early migratory cells are going to receive to become Schwann cells or adrenal gland cells or sympathetic neurons and so on and so forth. As I mentioned before, they've shown that these cells will migrate through the somites. So it's not really showing the somites here. These right here are not the somites. This is more of the lateral plate mesoderm. But they'll migrate through the somites. Now, some of these cells will stay in where the somites are at. These differentiate into sensory neurons, which we call the dorsal root ganglion. And the dorsal root ganglion, these are the cells that typically synapse with cells in the neural tube to start forming your peripheral nervous system. So here's where neural crest cells play a key role in joining your central nervous system, which is your spinal column and your brain, with your peripheral nervous system, which is all your sensory integration from the rest of your body. So that's what the dorsal root ganglia here is where these neural crest cells will migrate and then they'll stop in the somites. And they'll differentiate right there in the somites, in that somite area where the somites are undergoing their own gastrulation and their own morphogenesis. Some of these cells will stop right here, and they'll become Schwann cells that will myelinate the axons. Now, what axons are they myelinating? Well, there are axons that are motor neurons that are projecting their axons out to innervate your skeletal muscle tissue that need myelination. So as these axons are projecting out from the ventral neural tube, these neural crest cells are stopping right here, and they're starting to myelinate them. They're essentially surrounding these neurons, and that's what's starting to form the what we call the ventral root, which is where your motor neurons, where everything your body thinks when you move your muscles and whatnot, that's how these neurons communicate to your muscles and your tissues on what needs to happen. Some will migrate even further down to become the sympathetic ganglia. And then you have others that will migrate even further, closer to where the endocrine system is going to form, which essentially comes from the, you're getting endocrine tissue coming from the mesoderm and the endoderm. So it's going to be associated with things such as the adrenal medulla on top of your kidneys, and they're going to form some of these adrenal cells on that. Okay, so depending upon where they migrate and where they stop, they're going to receive various signals to differentiate into either dorsal root ganglion, Schwann cells, sympathetic ganglion, adrenal medulla cells. You can see here's the dorsolateral pathway where they migrate here, more along the dorsal side where the skin's going to form, and that will form the melanocytes. All right. So there are two main systems of your nervous system. You have the sympathetic neurons, and you have the parasympathetic neurons, fight or flight. Okay, so this is going to affect your organs in a fight or flight fashion. It turns off digestion, but it increases heart rate, increases respiratory rate, and so on and so forth, whereas typically the parasympathetic is rest and digest. So in many cases, It's not always, but in many cases, it's the opposite of what the sympathetic nervous system does. It will slow down the heart. It will slow down the respiratory rate. But the parasympathetic nervous system actually increases digestion. That's why it's called rest and digest. So when you're in a fight or flight response, it turns off digestion, the sympathetic nervous system, and in a rest and digest process, the parasympathetic will turn on digestion but bring other things down, such as your heart rate and your respiratory rate and things of that sort. Doesn't always do the opposite, but those are just some examples of how they work in conjunction with one another. Okay, so we'll talk more about some of these neurons here in a second. Now, you can see here, these are primarily the trunk neurons. So these neural crest cells in the trunk region will become the sympathetic ganglion, which will synapse with neurons from your spinal column, and that will then receive signals from your brain and from the various organs and start to cause things to be affected. Now, there's a big difference between the dorsal root ganglion and the sympathetic ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion, these are sensory neurons. These are ones that receive information from all of your peripheral nervous system. They receive temperature changes, they receive pressure and pain. They integrate with your nervous system and tell your brain what's going on outside. The sympathetic ganglia, these typically synapse with your motor neurons, and these are going to synapse with other parts to cause certain things to happen. Your heart rate to go up, your digestive system to slow down or increase. So these are the ones that are typically going to be affected and affect other types of organs after your brain tells your body what to do. Here's just an example. Again, some of these cells in this region are going to receive certain signals like FGF signaling, and they're going to become a neuron, whereas others will receive other signals when they get down to this region, like glucocorticoids, and that'll cause them to differentiate into, say, an adrenal cell. So it's all about where they migrate and what inductive signals they're going to receive during that migratory path, as well as where they end up. Let's talk about the vagal and sacral. This is really, they are the simplest. I said the cardiac was the simplest. These are the simplest. Why? Because there's only one fate. They become the parasympathetic ganglion. So when you look at the vagal and sacral, let's go back and look at where they form. Right here. They form up here, and they form down there. Well, guess where the parasympathetic ganglia form for your parasympathetic nervous system? Right up there and right down there. Same area. So that's where these nerve fibers or these ganglia are found that are part of your parasympathetic in the vagal and the sacral regions of your spinal column. So that's essentially the only derivative of the vagal and sacral neural crest cells is the parasympathetic ganglion that will innervate the same organs. So really, that's the difference between the sympathetic neurons, which are the fight or flight, and the parasympathetic neurons, which are the rest and digest. Those will synapse with various neurons, and when your brain tells your body to increase, it'll signal to the sympathetic neurons to do something, and when it wants you to rest, it'll signal to the parasympathetic neurons to do something else. So those are the 4 neural crest cells. We're going to talk a little bit more about neural crest cells as well as we go into some of these others, but